This is going to be one of the most practical and philosophically robust inner child healing videos that you'll find on YouTube, so please take the gold that I'm trying to give you. This isn't just book-based knowledge, it's what I've learned from working with clients for multiple months in a row as they've looked at the 5 stages of the inner child from baby to teenager and what works and what definitely does not work. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to summarize years of experience to help you make your inner child feel at home in your body, in your relationships, in your environment, and in your work. And hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls that people keep falling into, because the fundamental principle of this entire video is the difference between a permanent, safe residence or permanent love, and temporary love or temporary safety, or a pseudo-safety, pseudo-sensual fascination. And let me begin by giving an analogy. Maybe that will capture what I'm trying to indicate a little bit clearer. Imagine that you grew up in a neglectful or otherwise abusive family home. I know, kind of difficult to imagine, but just imagine for the sake of this video that you grew up in a home that you didn't quite enjoy. Going to be difficult for most people who watch this channel to imagine going there. Let's all pretend. You grew up in a home that you didn't enjoy. There were people in that home who didn't treat you the way that you want to be treated. They were either way too much or way too little. They were too hot or they were too cold. They were too close. They were too far away. They were inconsistent. They were emotionally abusive, or maybe much worse. But once per year, father and mother, they come together and they say, "We're going on a surprise vacation. We're going to your favorite theme park, whatever you want. We're going right now. Pack your bags. We're going in 15 minutes. Let's go, yippee." And you get in the car because you're a little person and you're excited. You forget all of the pain. You forget the fact that you don't quite feel loved in this home because you're going to the theme park. And you've got your Thomas the Tank Engine backpack or your Dora the Explorer or whatever you've got. You've got some childish joy to go to the theme park. You get to go on the rides, you get to go down the log slides, you get to go up and down and round, inside and out. You do the hokey cokey, and that's what it's all about, and you do it for one day and you do it with your full heart, and you get back home, you pull up in the driveway, the door closes behind you, and guess what? The arguments start, the coldness starts, the abuse starts all over again, and it's like that for another year until father and mother come down the stairs. Guess what? We're going to the theme park. And you put on your backpack year after year after year. Would you trade the theme park once per year for 364 days of safety and love? 364 days of genuine warmth, consistent, genuine, reliable love. I'm going to bet that you would. You don't care about the theme park. You don't care about the temporary sensations when you're given the opportunity to have something which is meaningful. Many of the people that I work with, the majority of the people who watch these videos, myself, if I'm being honest, we grew up in homes that weren't quite loving. Not fully. Some of our parents did their best. Some of our parents intentionally did much worse. But we didn't have safe, consistent, permanent love from both parents almost all of the time. Everyone makes mistakes, but that's what we're aiming towards. So why would the same principle of inner child healing be any different? Watch out for when you're repeating the patterns of the past. If your inner child healing is the equivalent of neglecting your inner child until you see a video on your YouTube homepage, or you hear a conversation from a friend and they say, "Hey, guess what? I went to this inner child healing workshop," and you go, "Oh yeah, my inner child, I haven't checked in with them in about 4 months. Okay, I'm going to do a nice guided active imagination, see what, oh look, they're scared and abandoned. I wonder why they don't want to talk to me." You're re-traumatizing based on the models of parenting that you received before. It's not your fault. It's very, 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 very normal. It's very difficult to maintain a consistent inner child relationship. How can we fix this? Fundamentally, I want you to move from this temporary pseudo-safety, pseudo-sensual distraction of the theme park and move towards a stable, loving relationship to the inner mother and the inner father. I'm going to do a bit of a literature dump so that you can know what these ideas are informed by. And please, do pick up the books and read them in your own time. I recommend that you read Healing the Child Within by Charles Whitfield. If you're a long-time viewer of the channel, you know what I'm going to do. There he is, handsome man, trust his guidance, Charles Whitfield, #1 inner child healing book, or maybe controversial statement. Some people are Bradshaw fanboys. Homecoming by John Bradshaw. These two books together, they are 90% of inner child healing. If you read just 2 books from this, go for these 2. And of course, where does the psychology comes from? It comes from deeper developmental psychology, such as D.W. Winnicott. Home is where we start from. This is one that I drew earlier. Actually, that's why this video is out a bit late. I spent a couple hours drawing that. But also, realistically, you need to look back a little bit further from the home and realize where your first home was, and it was in your mummy's belly. So, windows to the womb. That's going to be a pathway to embryology, understanding how trauma impacts you in utero, how the baby senses the danger in the environment, and all the various toxins and various chemical processes inside of mommy's belly become the processes in your own flesh. Very horror-like to think about that if you think of not only the substances that maybe mommy's taking, but also the energy that mommy's exposed to. This is deep psychology right here. Look into embryology. We've also got another assortment of books. Classic book to read, The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. This is a famous landmark book on what happens when children are not given the love they need. But of course, even the unloved child or the abused and hurt child can have visions of innocence. This fantastic book, which I only discovered recently by Edward Hoffman, it goes through a variety of spiritual, mystical, and meaningful synchronistic experiences in childhood. And you might relate to this. You might be someone who, like me, had a moment or two in childhood where you went out in nature, or you had a conversation with an angel, or dream about an angel, or something otherworldly happened in that darkness, in that death, in that desperation. There was some light. This book goes into that, and of course, if you really want to go deep into what they call attachment theory, why not go back into John Bowlby and his 1960s books? Attachment, Separation, and Loss. These are the 3 books that from the 1960s spun the entire field of attachment psychology. Actually, unless you're really into this work, I don't recommend you read these. I worked my way through this because I was unsatisfied with just how shallow it seemed the attachment theory literature was, so I went back to the founder of the idea, and they're very interesting books about chimpanzee mating, or maybe baboon mating, some kind of primate. I mean, we're all primates eventually, so you can go into that if you really want to. All of this literature, all of these various ideas has taken me years to assimilate, and there's a whole nother shelf. This shelf over here, right there, that's all trauma. A lot of it's all trauma, but this is particularly trauma around childhood. There's around 40 books over there. It's just a sample. To give you the most that I can to heal this pattern in a deep and enduring way, I want you to break down 2 ideas. 1, the inner child is not a single age. Your inner child is actually inner children. When were you your childhood self? Every single person who pauses and thinks about that question will give a different age. Someone will think 3, someone will think 7, someone will think 5, someone else will think 15. A different image comes to every mind because a different child exists within the imaginal forefront. And usually that child is the child that we learn the most from, or maybe it's the child that we have the best relationship with. For me, I think of my inner child around the age of 10. Because that's, for me, the focal point of when things really started to go wrong in my personal development, my personal well-being. So I've done a lot of work around the age 9, 10, 11 inner child, and then you have to expand it in both directions. Look at the small child, look at the teenager. Roughly speaking, you've got baby, stage 1, toddler, stage 2, small child, stage 3, Stage 4 is the big child, and then you go into the teenage years. But if you actually get granular, there's a huge difference between the 13-year-old and the 18-year-old. 18 is still a child, arguably some 25-year-olds are still children, so extended adolescence goes all the way through into the early 20s in these days. Honestly, it goes into the early 20s. Teenager isn't a single concept. The big child isn't a single concept. There's a difference between the age 8 to age 12 child. Roughly speaking, it's good enough for the sake of a single video. Fundamental principle, different ages of inner children were the different ages of the child that you were, and you would feel pretty offended if I talked to you now in the same way that I talked to you when you were a 5-year-old. Seems obvious. But you'd also be offended if when you were 12, I talk to you like you were a 5-year-old. You'd be offended, or maybe actually confused is more accurately the phrase that I'd use. You'd be confused if you were 12 years old and I talked to you like you were 18. This principle informs your inner child work in a much deeper way than you might realize. It's not just your active imagination, it's also the way that you reparent yourself. For me, and the philosophy that I work with, and I'm working with clients, I try and focus on the inner mother and the inner father. For simplicity's sake, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, the conditional self-respect of the divine father. There are conditions to be met. There are boundaries to be placed. You should not be doing this. You should be doing that. Loving principles. For example, it's good to go to school. You can't stay home from school today. It's good to go and socialize with friends. You're not going to stay home today. It's good to be eating good food. You're not going to eat all of that crap. That's the inner father. That's the conditional self-respect. And as an adult, of course, that's many things around boundaries, the yes, the no, but all informed from a loving place. Many of us didn't get a firm or even consistent loving relationship with the father. So you have to develop your inner father. When it comes to your inner mother, the other half of the reparenting matrix, quite literally the matrix, the maternal root of that love is compassion. Unconditional compassion. Some people would go as far to say unconditional love, but I see a real problem if you start to fixate on unconditional love rather than unconditional compassion, and that's because you've never really been given an example of unconditional love. You might feel triggered by that. Maybe you think of your grandma or your auntie or a friend or a school teacher, and they had unconditional love, but they didn't. Not at the level that unconditional would truly mean. They had certain conditions which needed to be met. There were times when they lost their temper, and there are things that they disapproved of, and maybe they were doing it so effectively that you never realized that they were disapproving of certain aspects of your being and they were guiding you somewhere else. This isn't necessarily a manipulative thing, but the unconditionally loving mother, hypothetically speaking, can't be a real entity because she is human unless she has truly unlocked unconditional self-love. She can't emanate that into the world. Otherwise, there's going to be layers of projection, there's going to be layers of shadow expectations, and it's not a real thing. It's a story, it's a fantasy, it's almost a savior complex in itself, or a victim dreaming of the savior. I know I'm getting pedantic on the words, but the reason I'm twisting that just a little bit is that people really trip themselves up in terms of inner child work because they get the idea of conditional self-respect, the masculine principle, is almost easier to bring through. It's maybe more difficult to enact on a day-to-day basis, but we get the idea that there are good things and bad things and there should be lines. But we have an immature relationship to unconditionality in both our own relationship to ourselves, our relationship to our inner children, and of course, unconditional love in romantic relationships is not really that reliable. So aim for unconditional compassion. So much more realistic, and it's at least 90% of the way towards unconditional love. If you can be unconditionally compassionate to yourself, your romantic partner, your children, and your inner children, you are pretty far along the saintly spectrum. Truly maintaining unconditional compassion, truly being forgiving and loving and warm and understanding. That's the divine mother principle. Together, we call that reparenting. The divine father, the divine mother, your inner dad, your inner mom. They come together to reparent the children throughout those different ages from 0 to 18 or to 25 or even in utero if you want to go back into the embryology perspective. But how do we make this truly practical to give you something that you can really work with today, to make an enduring place for your inner child to feel safe? I've got 4 categories that I want you to focus on. If you're going to apply these principles of, yes, I understand there's children between all these ages, I understand that there's a masculine principle and a feminine principle, roughly speaking, I know it's a stereotype, just go with it for the sake of a 25-minute video, there's a masculine and a feminine principle. How do I apply this in my life? How do I break the pattern of 364 days of abusive abandonment, neglecting energy, and one great theme park experience? You have to be consistent across all the areas of life where your inner child is a participant. And I've identified 4 areas that you could focus on. You've got your body. I'm looking at my notes. You've got your environment, you've got your relationships, and you've got your work life or your school life. There's intersections between those categories, but let's start with the body. You are an adult in your adult body. If you have an inner child, where do they exist within you? Are they a real thing? Are they a real person? Are they a psychological construct? Doesn't really matter where you place the mind. Some people place the mind as a psychological, energetic entity or matrix or cloud of being. The aura itself is the mind, and we exist within that. There's many different metaphysical systems. For simplicity's sake, if we're going to say that the inner child is within you, if we're going to go with the psychological diagram of classic, right there, the inner child, the inner babies within the inner child, we've got the Russian dolls within us. Which body is that inner child existing within? And is that body poisonous? It's not that you're a bad person, but if you're consuming poison, dietary, technological, relationship poison, don't be surprised if your inner child wants to run away from home. We can look at the environmental aspect, we can look at the work aspect, we can look at the romantic relationship aspect. They're all secondary to the home that your inner child lives within. You're disgracing yourself if you're mistreating yourself. And yourself is not just you as an adult, it's you in the future in your highest version, and it's you all the way through the timeline of your past. You can imagine getting older and growing wiser, God willing, growing wiser, growing stronger, growing happier. If you've got a dark history behind you, know that you're all extended through, almost like a thread from your heart, going all the way to your final breath and all the way back to the first. From cradle to crypt, it's you all the way. This is your one body. This is your one vehicle. Love that body and treat that body with the Divine Father and Divine Mother principle, and you will start to integrate the inner children in a very consistent basis. It's the number one foundation. What is the requirement for a healthy home for a child? You don't feed a 5-year-old Jack Daniels. You don't give a 10-year-old cigarettes. I mean, I was given cigarettes when I was 10, and I was given alcohol when I was younger, but that's all for another day. In ideal circumstances, you aren't exposed to alcohol and cigarettes when you're too young to have them, and then at a certain point in your adult life, you realize that they're poisonous anyway, and I'm gonna take those away from me because they're not doing me any good. That's an obvious idea. That's an obvious point. I don't need to go too deep into it. If you haven't gone sober, or at least significantly sober, start to do that for the sake of you and the sake of your inner child, in the same way that you imagine 8-year-old you going into a smoke-filled living room. Mom, why do you keep smoking? You're poisoning your inner child with that. Poisoning real children. Just stop it. At the next level up, it's your psychological diet. It's what you're doing with your screens. It's what you're consuming. If you're consuming trash and you're depleting your energetic charge, don't be surprised if your inner child goes into the back room and doesn't want to come out. Don't be surprised, this is where the metaphor becomes real, the 8-year-old you goes into the living room and on the TV is a horror film. Or something. Maybe you were a kid who liked horror films because you were particularly dark. I get it, I know. Sometimes children are like that, and probably a high proportion of the people watching my channel probably enjoyed horror films. I personally hated them. I'm going to say my life was enough of a horror as it is. I'll just say it. As it is, I found enough to be worried about in my day-to-day existence to not need to go and watch horror films. I'm bringing myself into the video because I feel the realness of this concept, and the reason I don't watch horror films now as an adult, the reason I try not to pollute my consciousness with adult distractions on those websites, and I try not to spend too much time on this bloody device, is not just for me, but it's for my future self and it's for my past selves. That thread from my heart through this body, this one body, that I try my best to love. It's the vehicle for all time. For me, from my perspective, I didn't have the agency when I was younger to be able to choose what happened to this body and to choose the environment that I lived in. For those first 18 years, I didn't get that choice until I moved out. This is the second point we'll go into. We'll finish on the body. I didn't get that choice to feed myself. My parents tried their best, but I grew up in a regular British home and I had a diet of beige. I had chips, I had pies, I had sausages, I had baked beans on toast, and I had all spectrum of brown and pale white. Microwave, oven, didn't really matter, very little fresh food. Only salt and pepper and chives in the cupboard. I wasn't fed that well. I was fed. Again, lack of education is just a bizarre thing to reflect on, especially in British culture in regards to food. This really low standard of food. That wasn't my choice until I became a bodybuilding 16-year-old, and I went on to my chicken and rice back in the day when I used to eat chicken. I started to feed myself. I started to learn what it means to have good quality food in my body the best I could. It was still cheap, but I tried. That switched on for me at 16. I hope the principle lands. If your inner child is getting to a point of stagnation, if you're finding that you're going through these moments where you're being overly playful or you're abandoning your responsibilities, and as an adult you're getting too caught up in procrastination, all of these symptoms of inner child disease or inner child stress could begin at the bodily level of you being in a home that isn't quite clean enough for them to feel at home. And your future self, if you want to extend out of the confines of this single YouTube video, is your future self, is your higher self, is your true self truly going to manifest, materialize, or concretize in a body which feels like death, or at the very least, if not like death, a body which doesn't feel like life. Something that I find motivating. It's strong language, I know my energy is intense, I'm not trying to shame anyone. That's the righteous, divine masculine inner father within me. There's boundaries, there's rules, and also, here I am. I can shift into the softer, more compassionate mother. I get it. It took me a long time to learn these lessons. I'm still not perfect. Let's focus on the environmental aspect. This is the extension of, well, where does the child live? You lived in your parents' home. Most people watching this video at least lived in their parents' home. Some with their grandparents, and auntie and uncle, others in family homes or non-family homes. Let's just go with the parents' example. When you live in a home of two adults who've decided to live in a certain part of the world under certain conditions, you have no agency. The bedroom you've got is the bedroom you've got. The food that you've got is the food that you've got. The parents that you've got, guess what? They're the ones that you're stuck with. There's no way to change the environmental influences. If your mother's angry, if your father's anxious, if your mother's overly involved in your life, and your father is completely absent, you don't get a choice in those energies. If you're a sensitive child like me, you might be in your room and you can feel the energy seeping up from the floor below. You can hear the raised voices. You can hear the hushed conversations. And more importantly, you can feel it. The environment itself is the second layer from the body. And if your adult environment is not conducive to the safety required for inner child integration, it's your responsibility to change that. It can't be an immediate move for most people. But if you're not living in the part of the world that you need to be living in, geographically, because of weather conditions or because of the kinds of people in your neighborhood, make the plan over the years ahead with your savings, with your sensible forwards thinking to put yourself in the environment where you will flourish again. Thread from cradle to crypt. Your body goes along that journey, and on that journey there are many different dwellings that you'll live in. There'll be homes that become your own. You get to choose who lives in that building with you. You get to decorate your room. This is a practical, non-metaphorical level. You get to style your room in the way that makes you feel good and makes your inner child feel good. You get to organize your possessions or choose your possessions. You get to choose who comes in. Your friends, your family, and what degree. Of course, everyone's got different circumstances, but you get to control, influence, and shape your environment for the service of self, future self, and past self. It's a simple principle. If you're ignoring the actual responsibility to clean up your immediate environment and expecting that your inner child is going to come skipping and laughing from your active imagination, don't be surprised if you're mistaken. It won't work on a consistent basis. The 8-year-old boy or girl develops an aversion to walking into the living room filled with smoke. The 13-year-old doesn't want to come back home after their parents have been fighting, so they stay out on the street. The 18-year-old doesn't go back to visit the family because the family doesn't come to visit them. They realize, I've been gone for 3 months now and they didn't come and visit. I'm only 15 minutes away. I'm only 40 minutes away. Or maybe you're halfway across the world, but they didn't call. There's all these moments where you get removal from the environment as a child. You go to someone else's home. You go to a friend's home. You go to school. And this is another point that we're going to make, the point of school environment. When you go to a new environment, the inner child and the literal child that you were gets new opportunities of mirroring and relationship and expression. As an adult, you have a work life. Some people will still be in school, but let's go with work. Your work environment is an extension of the public environment. You have your private home environment, you have your bodily environment, your private space, and then your public space. Again, same principle. I'm repeating myself ad nauseum. Your inner child healing will not remain permanent and enduring if you have a workplace where your inner child does not want to go with their parent to work. If you ever had those situations where it's like, go with your parent to work day and you didn't like what they were doing, you didn't like the environment, just apply the same principle. Would your inner child be proud of the work that you're doing? Have you let them down? If you look at yourself in the mirror and you remember who you were when you were 5 or 10 years old, are you where they would want you to be? Life isn't perfect. Many of the dreams that we have as children to be footballing, millionaire, celebrity, astronaut, doctors, it doesn't happen, I get that. But energetically speaking, even if it's not the material, even if it's not the archetypal or the role-based fantasy of the inner child, is it safe and rewarding? Is it nourishing to be in your work environment of choice? For me personally, based on the work that I do, this is my work environment. I film videos in this library. I work with my clients via online sessions in this library. And when I go out and travel and meet people here and there, and in the future, more workshops, more podcasts, I've chosen environments that my inner child would be pretty happy to tag along with me. Because that's what I want. That's what they want. That's what my future self wants. Again, continuum across time, I'm making the point over and over again. A true idea, a true personal energy will be consistent over time. There is something to be said for the character of a soul, the texture of a soul. They're pretty consistent over the years. If you look back at some of the defining traits of you as a child, they're probably consistent with you as an adult, and it's probably going to remain consistent into the future. Let your work environment be a reflection, be a container, and also be an amplifier of the best qualities of the inner children that you were. Make sure that you can be happy in your work life with your 5-year-old, your 10-year-old, your 15-year-old, your 25-year-old, all hanging out and interacting and doing something over there while you're at your laptop or you're writing something or you're having a conversation with someone. They should belong in that space, because otherwise there's a fragmentation in there. We can't get it perfect. I understand that people have responsibilities. I understand that you might have a family, or you might have taxes, or you might have debts, or you might have something. You need to be in a job that's not ideal, but just plan things out for the next 5 years. Make the move if you need to make the move. And of course, the final point for permanent inner child healing. It's a deep point, but I'll cover it quickly. Make sure you're in a romantic relationship where your inner child feels safe, nourished, seen, and feels like they can participate. Yes, it's time for man to woman, 80% of the time. That's what you should be doing. You should be adults, having an adult relationship with all the beauty of what it means to be an adult, with the clarity of consciousness, with the articulation of your language, with the ability to play in an adult way. But you should also have the ability to play in very childlike ways, and if I'm being straight to the point, you should have the ability, if you're a man, to go into your inner father and look after her little girl. If you're a woman, you should be able to go into your inner mother and look after that little boy who you call your boyfriend, your husband. In those moments where life gets you down, you should be able to shift. Not play the role perpetually. I don't want you to be permanently in, like, I'm in the daddy position and you're my little girl and you're kind of doing this savior victim complex, or vice versa. Mommy's tying up little 40-year-old husband's shoes in an energetic level. That's what you're doing. Those aren't the dynamics I'm talking about. 80% adult consciousness. But some space for the inner child, maybe 10%, and a 10% space for the soul. At all bands of the stages of consciousness, the inner child from the past, you see what I'm doing, inner child from the past, adult in the present and for the immediate years ahead, and the higher self, the transpersonal self, the spiritual self, stretching out there and imbuing like a beautiful ray of sunshine that goes across the whole journey and also loops back round underneath. You're encapsulated in the final breath. From the first breath, it's all there. So choose a romantic relationship that your inner child can participate in. And if you're not in a relationship, look out for that. If you're currently in a relationship and you feel like there's room for more inner child safety, do this in a way which is sensible. Don't suddenly demand that your partner cares about your inner child if you have never mentioned this concept or it's only been a fleeting concern. Again, how hypocritical. If you've only just started doing inner child work and you've ignored your inner child for 20, 30 or 40 years, don't place that demand on them. They don't need to respond to that right now. You can introduce them, but do it slowly. Or if they already know these concepts and you're both pretty conscious, just create the consistent moments of connection. It shouldn't be way too much. It shouldn't be nothing at all. Bring out the deeper levels of two inner children playing together. And eventually, if you want to go to the top tier level of conscious relationship, your inner father, your inner mother, their inner father, their inner mother, it doesn't matter the gender dynamic, and the inner children across all timelines. Imagine that family home where the 5 or 6 or 7 inner children of both the mother and the father then get to participate in the growing of the next generation. You're in contact with your healthy inner 5-year-old, and so are they. So when your 5-year-old comes up to you, you know how to play, you know how to love, you know how to listen, and you know how to be with them exactly where they're at, while also being aware of where they're going, where they've been, and how you can look after them. That is the gift of inner child healing. We have gone so far in such a short period of time from the highly sensory, pseudo-sugary theme park solution, which is the equivalent of a weekend workshop or reading just one of these books. You read this book, Visions of Innocence, and you're like, oh my God, my spiritual experiences in childhood. Wow, it's amazing. And you think about it for one day, you go to sleep, you're back to work, you forget about it. That's the theme park equivalent. You're not intentionally abusive, you're not intentionally abandoning, you're not intentionally neglectful, but that's happening nonetheless. Abandon those old patterns. If there's one invitation that I can leave you on, one final point of resonance, just make sure that you're going for permanency rather than what feels good right now. And that means unconditional compassion, conditional self-respect, wedded together, and I call that self-love. And if you're looking at yourself from an archetypal, temporal perspective, self to the end, self from the beginning, and everybody gets to enjoy the party of being you. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Go back to the part of the video where I'm recommending all the books. Just look in the timestamps, buy 3 or 4 of them. Don't let this be the last moment. Don't let this be another theme park ride on the distraction roller coaster of inner child healing. Do something permanent and enduring before you go to the next video. Please don't continue the pattern. You went through enough years of that. Go back, buy some of the books. If you've seen them before and you're like, oh, I should get that one, definitely get that one. I'll see you in the comment section with your stories. But go back, timestamp, screenshot, order the book. It's a gift. It's a gift to your former self, and you'll get to experience the benefits.